Hi, we're back. This class is going to look specifically at natural selection and how natural selection takes place. Remember, natural selection is the how of evolution. We know evolution is slow incremental change over time. Things change over time. How do they change over time? That's the theory of natural selection. And that was the work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, if you remember back two classes. So, diving in, uh, the process of natural selection, how does it work? How do we end up with those tall giraffes out there? And why did the short ones die off? And we're left with these giant giraffes out on the planet. Um, these four steps are key to understanding natural selection. These are described by Charles Darwin initially and Wallace as well. They looked at all the different diversity out there and they said, well, if you're going to have things change, you have to have a variety of things in the first place. Just look at humans. Look at our pigmentation, skin tones around the world. Not everyone is homogeneous. We're not all the same. So we have genetic variation within the human population, and you can see it. They would argue now with giraffes, back to that example, it's a really nice example, easy one to use, that as there's less and less and less food for these things to survive, you start to see competition. In order to evolve, competition needs to be there because then you're going to have a struggle for survival. And that next step, you see this process called survival of the fittest will take place to where the tallest, in this case of the giraffes, are going to survive and pass on their genes. And that leads on to the next part, number 4 down here, which is talking about reproduction. And you have to get to a reproductive age in order to pass on your genes. So you have to survive long enough and compete long enough to pass on those genes. So moving along here, I'll post some of these nice videos. These are really handy videos to understanding how all this works, and I'll post those in the descriptions below, and some entertaining videos as well. A couple key things to note here, some definitions between species and speciation. I won't just read them, they're there for you. An interesting group to look at is the bonobo versus the chimpanzee. Very, very similar, but they have actually speciated. We can see where they live along the equatorial Africa, over on the Congo Basin. Bonobos were separated from chimpanzees long ago by a river, a large river. They don't swim, and having more access to more food, this species actually developed their society. It's quite interesting to note that their society is developed based on love and relationships. So you get dominance and the hierarchy of things by embracing and supporting and loving your family members and your clan members. Whereas chimpanzees become more warlike and more aggressive to get dominance. And that's just separated by one river, and you start to see speciation take place based on the food that's there and the struggle for survival. So a lot more food, a lot easier life for these guys, and things change over time. There's a few different types of speciation, and that speciation will occur because of a few different types of separations in species. So you have these 3 listed here. We have geographic, temporal, and behavioral. So geographic sounds just like it reads. It's geography. There's a whole course you can take in university, island biogeography, and looking at islands specifically, and the Galapagos are a great example of that, where Wallace studied in the South Pacific, another great example of that. How species can be separated geographically from other species and given some time to change and adapt to their habitat separately, and then breed that gene over and over and over again, and eventually you might speciate. Temporal deals with time, and thinking about flowers specifically is an interesting example. If you're going to survive, you need to find your niche to survive, especially when it's very crowded. And temporal isolation is this idea where certain flowers actually wait till bloom till different times of the year because there's different pollinators out there that will take care of passing on their pollen and continuing their gene. So spreading out over time, you reduce the competition, and everything can then survive rather than everything fighting for one species to take over. Behavioral isolation, we see that in thick rainforests and different species of birds. Again, rather than one species taking over completely, sometimes behavioral isolation can move a bird to the top of the tree and change its behavior, how it hunts, and where it lives its life. So in the canopy, you can get one species of bird having speciated from another species in the middle of the canopy, and then one that actually survives more based on the ground fodder that falls from the tree. So behavioral isolation is also one way you can separate. Notice that in temporal and behavioral isolation, you haven't actually gone to a completely different place. These are occurring actually, and it could be in the exact same space. Some examples to think about are these three species of elephants, subspecies of elephants. And I was going to have the class look at this actually and think about why these elephants look the way they do and where are they on the planet. Something to consider. Take a second, pause the video, and think about why those are and what may have made them change. Behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, what might it have been? I'll let you think about that one. Another example to think about also is these tortoises that Charles Darwin actually studied. This is the Galapagos Islands, the cluster of islands, and note the different carapaces, the shells on these tortoises, quite different, and the neck length. You could definitely see a difference, especially between these two. Can you imagine what kind of food exists in those places? Because remember, nature is selecting. This one it doesn't have a long neck because it really wants a long neck. Nature has actually selected who survives. So on this island, very likely, I don't even have to go there, but very likely the food source for this is up high. And it's probably hard to reach. So those with long necks are eating. Those with short necks are dying. Therefore, long necks are passing on long neck features, long neck genes to the next generation. And inevitably, over time, you start to see this type of tortoise on this island versus the food source is probably low and hard to get to, down on the ground, below thick shrubs, potentially over here, I would imagine. I haven't been there, but by looking, you can get a good indication of what's going on. These are some of the different finches that we would see on the Galapagos as well, and some questions to consider. I'll just leave these up for a second. You can push pause and try to answer them. I'll be done in just a second, Billy. And the next thing that I was going to have you do is look for different examples of evolution. These are three that we've just discussed. So the finches, the elephants, and the pepper moths in our last class. And then also, it's important that you have your own, something that you think is, that you're connected to a bit more. In the last class, we looked at the Archaeopteryx, pentadactyl limbs, dogs, cats, fruits, vegetables, those kind of things. So think about something that hit home with you and have that as a solid piece of evidence to support you, because you are expected to do that on an exam, to have your own evidence. So with that, I'll leave you with an important question to dig into. If you can do that, that is huge. That's a very difficult thing to put together. Explain how natural selection leads to evolution. Sounds easy, but there's a lot of information behind it. And finally, go into Cognity, please, at this point, and revisit these two chapters, 321 and 322. Do those questions, see that you're getting this at this point. Send me an email if you're not, or leave a comment in the description below, as they say. Okay, bye. I hope this is helpful for now, and I'll talk to you later. The